because you wrote in your book writing that you write to Metallica.
You're asking, do I still write to heavy metal?
Yeah.
Man, I used to play rock music. My hearing is shot, let's put it that way, you know, because the louder the better, and the rougher the better. And I used to write, when I used to compose that way, but a lot of times I was pretty loaded when I did it. But these days, I usually write in silence and rewrite with a lot of metal playing. I wouldn't say that it's all metal. That wouldn't be fair. Yes, I like AC/DC. I like Metallica, Judas Priest, Anthrax. A lot of metal bands that I like, but I also like James McMurtry and John Prine and people who are sort of on the alt country side.
Yes, but
Yeah, where are you?
sorry.
Juste ici. I am at the back.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, Pascal Deschamps from France. Two very simple questions. I was very happy to read about Danny Torrance again. I wanted to know, you mentioned it very quickly at the beginning, why you wanted to reconnect with Danny so many years after creating him.
Well, he had such a rough childhood. She asked about Danny Torrance and why come back to him. He never really left my mind because I'm thinking to myself, here's a little kid who grew up in an abusive household with a father who broke his arm and was always on the hair trigger of violence. The kid knows it. And he was also an alcoholic, a child of an alcoholic. You know, in the language of today, that makes him a codependent. And I read a definition of a codependent. A codependent is a person who, if they're drowning, someone else's life flashes before their eyes. And so, you know, I've known a lot of people, and I think we all have, who may say, well, I grew up in a family where dad beat mom, or dad beat mom and me and the other kids, or I grew up in a family where dad would come home drunk and we had to tiptoe around him because he was apt to be ugly and mean and that sort of thing. And they would finish by saying, I will never do that. And then they find themselves at 21, you know, with a drink in their hands and getting in bar fights. The past has a tendency to repeat itself. And so I thought to myself, I want to see what's going on with this kid as a grown-up and what happened to his shining. I got curious, and that doesn't happen to me very often. Usually, you know, when I get to the end of the story, I'm done with those people not because I don't like them anymore, but because I don't know what happens next. I would love to know what happens next to Lacey Landon in Lacey's story, but I don't. So little by little, the story of Dr. Sleep and what happened to Danny started to form in my head, and eventually the book was a result.
We've got a question here, Stephen, from Juri Vuorotama, a Finnish journalist. I'm probably killing his name. He says that the story goes that you spent a night in Stanley Hotel's room 217 in Colorado way back in 1974 and got the inspiration for The Shining after some ghostly incidents.
Well, that's bullshit. That's totally bullshit. Yeah, no, is it truth or is it bullshit? It's bullshit. But it was the Stanley Hotel. But there were no ghostly happenings of the sort that this journalist is talking about. It was a ghostly experience. And what happened was, my wife and I had a little girl when we were married, and we had a little boy who came along shortly after that, who's now Joe Hill, who writes his own novels, and I'm very proud of him. He's a terrific guy, but of course I would say that anyway, because I'm his dad. But what I'm trying to say is we had children young, and our honeymoon was a weekend in Boston, which we could ill afford. So 4 years into the marriage, we hadn't had any time off. And we were living in Colorado. I was writing really nothing in particular at that point. And we had my wife's younger sister with us as sort of an au pair. And she said, why don't you guys take the weekend for yourselves and just go somewhere, and I'll take care of the kids. So we got in the car and we went up the mountains you know, and we came to this beautiful hotel in Estes Park, the Stanley Hotel. And we were very much fish against the current because everybody else was checking out and we were checking in. And I asked if we could stay the weekend, and the lady said, you can stay if you can pay cash. We sent all our credit card slips back to Denver. And I had traveler's checks for the weekend, so we stayed, and we were the only guests of the hotel. And it was creepy, because the wind was howling outside, and we went into the dining room, and all the chairs were up on the tables, and the music was piped in, and it was very, very strange. And we had some wine, and we had a nice dinner. As nice a dinner as you can have when you're in this huge dining room and there's nobody else there. And my wife went back to the room, and I stayed and soaked up the atmosphere a little bit, and then I started back to the room where we were staying, and I passed one of those old canvas fire hoses on the wall, and I thought, gee, what if that turned into a snake and came after me? And by the time that I got back to our room, I had the whole book in my head, but there were no ghosts or anything. But it was a very interesting and ultimately profitable weekend.
You go ahead.
Next question?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, Alexandre Poncet from Mad Movies Magazine. Thanks for being here, really.
Thank you.
I've got two short questions. You only directed one feature film in your career. Did you ever want to do another? And do you still write one short movie every year, like you explain in Everything is Eventual?
Do I write every day of the year? Was that the question?
Every year you explain in the introduction
Oh,
a short novel, a short story.
Well, they come when they come. There's no real rhyme or reason for it. I've been fairly fortunate in terms of being able to put together a lot of stories. They don't come as frequently as they used to be. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I always used to feel like my head was jammed with ideas. It was as if somebody had yelled fire in a crowded theater, because I had a lot of stuff going on. And now, having said that, I've completely forgotten the other half of your question.
You directed one movie in your career. Did you want to do another one in your career?
If I could direct another
Yeah.
movie? Oh man, yes, I'd love to do it. It was a Maximum Overdrive, a terrible movie. But you have to keep in mind that when I did it, I was working with an all-Italian film crew, and we didn't understand each other. I was drunk or stoned for most of the time, but mostly I had no film experience. And so the whole film was like this high-pressure tutorial. And I think I could probably do a better job the next time, but who knows? It would be fun to try it again, though. Yeah.
Next in the bottom here.
Hello, I'm Stefan Alix from Inres and in Explorer magazine. It seems that you're very familiar with the psychic experience and this world of supernatural. And in the book, Dan, at one moment, is taking care of that lady who is passing away. I was wondering, what do you think is happening when we are dying?
Well, I'm more interested in the actual experience of dying than I used to be, because I'm closer to it than I used to be. It seems a lot less like an academic subject to me than it did a few years ago. I was talking to my wife the other day and mentioning to her that there's a song by Paul Simon on the album Bookends where there's a lyric that goes, "How terribly strange to be 70." And Paul Simon is now 72, so take that, Paul, how strange that is. So, you know, and of course the Beatles went on 64, which probably seemed like an academic idea to them now. Paul McCartney, my wife calls him Old Dog Eyes. He's older than God at this point, so, you know, that does happen. So I'm interested in the subject of dying, but also there's a universality to it. It's the one thing that we all go through, every one of us. There are no exceptions. The only other thing that we all go through, I think, is birth. And after that, it's all up for grabs. But we've all seen birth and we've all experienced it and we've lived through it. Nobody's ever come back to talk about the actual death experience. So it's a mystery, and mysteries interest me, so I've written about that. And I guess in an effort to understand it to some degree, yeah.
Next,
Madame.
we are waiting for here, okay.